Hey everyone, today we continue our walk through the Bible, one book, one verse at a time, and today we'll look at the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is a bit of a confusing book in some ways, particularly the last half. It's a series of visions, and it's written as apocalyptic literature, much like the visions in Ezekiel. And the visions are there to show that God is sovereign over all, and over all kingdoms, no matter what happens within the world. That is true. And this is important for the people like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we find them in exile in a foreign land, and they're not necessarily sure, or the people who might be reading this book aren't necessarily sure if God is really in control. But we see in Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego an absolute devotion to this God and a recognition that God is sovereign. I mean, this is the book where we get the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That happens later in the book, where he is entrapped, and even though he continues to pray to God and not to the current empire, and then he's thrown into the lion's den, God protects him from the mouth of the lions. And that mirrors, or that's similar to a story that happens earlier, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow to a statue of Baal and instead bowed only to God, and then they were thrown in the fiery furnace. And through all of this, there's this commitment to observing and knowing that God is ruler over all. Now, one of the difficulties that the readers may have had, and that we sometimes have, is that things don't go the way that we think they should in the world, the way that we think God should do them, and not necessarily even just for us. Like sometimes, yes, we're selfish, and there are times in which we just want things to happen the way that we want them to. And when they don't, then we do get a little bit upset. But there are other moments when we are firmly convinced that it would be better if God did this. And actually, when you look at his promises, we see that it is. And it would be better if he did whatever that might be, if he ended poverty, if he stopped wars, if he came back and made all things new, if he healed diseases, if he helped people who had broken relationships. I mean, all of these different kinds of things. We know that it would be better. We don't always know why he allows things to happen the way that they do. Which brings me to the key verse in the book of Daniel, and it's one that exhibits that kind of absolute trust in God, recognizing that he is sovereign over all and that what he wants to have happen will happen, but trust that even if what we want to have happen doesn't happen, we can trust that God is in control. Now, this is in Daniel 3. This is after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had refused to bow down to this statue and this idol. And they refused to give up their faith and trust in God as the one who is ruler over all. And so they're sentenced to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And this is what they say. This is Daniel 3, verse 17. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Now, this is hugely comforting for us, but also a major challenge, because there are times in which we sometimes seek to kind of rule or run the life our own way. And when things don't turn out that way, it's hard to trust God. So the encouragement that you can see from this book, and actually through all of the books we've looked at so far, is we've seen that God has been faithful to his people, even though they haven't been faithful to him, and he always will be faithful. And we can be confident and follow him regardless of what happens. So may you be encouraged this week. May you trust God and his rule over all things, even if things don't turn out the way that you want them to.